Welcome back to a little bit of philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 3, Lecture 6, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Mind. In this short video, we'll introduce the main questions of this subdivision of metaphysics, but we'll primarily focus on the mind-body problem. One of the most perplexing phenomena we experience as humans is consciousness. We all know we're conscious, even if we can't be sure that anyone else is. After all, we have direct access to our own minds, but we can only infer the existence of minds in others, based on their behavior. But what exactly is this mind? What is its nature, its destiny? Assuming that there are other minds, what makes mine distinct from theirs? These are some of the vexing questions we face when we start to apply the philosophical method to this thing we call consciousness, or mind, or soul. The philosophy of mind is the division of metaphysics that attempts to answer questions like these regarding mental phenomenon. There are three core questions that form the heart of the philosophy of mind. What is the relationship between minds and bodies? What makes an individual mind that particular mind? And can the mind exist independently from the body? We often hear people talk about a mind-body connection, which begs the question, are they really two different things? And if they are two different things, how do they interact with each other? Bodies are objects. They have mass and size and shape and location in space and time. They're made of matter. But our thoughts don't seem to have any of those properties. Our thoughts don't seem to have shape. Nor would we ask, how big is your idea, unless we're speaking metaphorically. It would also seem strange to ask, where is that idea? If someone did ask me that, I'd say, well, in my mind. But where is that? So we need to get clear on whether or not minds and bodies really are different things, and if not, why do they seem different? Equally troubling is what exactly it is that makes my mind mine. What differentiates one mind from another, assuming that there really are other minds out there? The obvious answer, of course, would be to say that they contain different information, different content, different thinky things. But over time, the mental phenomena that compose my own mind change. In fact, I'm thinking different things from one moment to the next. Is my mind ever really the same set of thinky things? And if not, how can it be one and the same mind at different times? And what about the ontological status of our minds? Does mental content exist even when the body doesn't? Do our minds exist before our bodies, or do they continue to exist after our bodies die? Where would minds go? Each of the basic questions of the philosophy of mind are interesting and worthy of serious consideration, but since we have rather limited time here, we're going to focus on just one of those questions, what we call the mind-body problem. Perhaps it's merely a consequence of our language, but we intuitively draw a distinction between our mind and our body. If we get up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water and happen to stub our toe along the way, we don't say, ouch, I stubbed myself. Instead, we'd say, I stubbed my toe. This suggests that the toe is not you, but rather something that belongs to you. Now, this is a silly example, of course, but it highlights the point that we do tend to draw a distinction between ourselves and our bodies. We tend to think of bodies as being physical objects that exist in space and time. They have extension, that is, they occupy space. They have shape, size, mass, color, etc. On the other hand, we don't generally attribute these physical properties to our minds or the objects of our minds, that is, our thoughts. An idea, a memory, a thought, a belief, a hunch, all these thinky things seem to be free of properties like mass, or size, or motion, or extension, or shape. Now, given that this is our common sense view, it's a good place for us to begin the analysis. So, for the sake of argument, let's grant that minds and bodies are different in some fundamental ontological sense. They both exist, but they exist differently or in different ways from one another. If our assumption that minds and bodies are in some fundamental way different from one another, we run up against a very serious puzzle. How do these two very different things interact with each other? They certainly seem to interact, as we saw from the example of stubbing the toe in the middle of the night. Hitting my toe against a chair is an example of physical causation. The forward motion of my foot comes in contact with the chair, which is not moving. Due to the electromagnetic resistance, my toe and the chair can't occupy the same space at the same time, so my toe is deflected from the solid surface of the chair. But that physical event, two physical objects coming in contact with each other, also seems to create another effect, a mental effect, a thinky thing. That is, of course, the pain that I feel as a result of the collision. So, in my subjective experience, the physical event seems to cause a mental event. Being a mental event, the pain is in my mind, not in the chair or even in my foot. Somehow the collision of two physical bodies has given rise to a non-physical event, the pain and the awareness of the pain. So how exactly is that supposed to work? How can the collision of two physical bodies in space and time cause a non-physical event like the feeling of pain? Philosophers have thought about this problem for a long time, and those who begin from the perspective of a dualist ontology have come up with various explanations of this inter-ontological mechanism. We'll examine 4 different attempts to explain exactly what's going on here. But before we do, we need to step aside for just a second and make a distinction between 2 different forms of dualism that will help bring this problem into much sharper focus. In our very brief introduction to metaphysics, we defined metaphysical dualism as the view or the claim that there are 2 different kinds of substance or stuff that the universe is made of. We can now more narrowly apply this label to what we'll call substance dualism. Matter is the stuff out of which physical objects are made, and mind, or consciousness, or soul, is the stuff out of which consciousness is made. In the Western philosophical tradition, Plato from the ancient period and René Descartes from the modern period are excellent examples of this type of dualism. Plato draws a distinction between the perceivable world and the conceivable world, while Descartes labels them thinking substances versus extended substances. These are just different labels for the same basic ontological distinction that substance dualists make. But there is another kind of dualism that focuses not on the stuff from which things are made, but rather the kind of properties that might be attached to one kind of stuff. Let's suppose that there is only one kind of stuff, and we're going to call it matter. An atom would be an extended body or material object that is composed of this material stuff, electrons, neutrons, and protons. Let's take a single molecule of water, H2O. It's composed of 1 oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. Each molecule of water has these basic or elemental properties, that is, properties that are necessary constituents of the thing itself. But water, as we all know, can be in one of 3 states. It can either be in solid form, liquid form, or the form of a gas. But a single molecule of water doesn't have any of those properties. It can't be in any of those states. Take, for example, the state of solidity. It can only emerge when there are at least 2 molecules that form a crystalline structure through hydrogen bonding at 0 degrees Celsius. Thus, Solidity would be what we call an emergent property, a property that emerges out of a sufficiently complex set of states of elemental properties. Now, the dualist theories of mind-body interaction that we're going to introduce will primarily be versions of substance dualism, but as we'll see, there's one theory of interaction that would be compatible with something like property dualism, where the mind is an emerging property or emergent property out of sufficiently complex neurological sets. The most traditional theory of mind-body interaction is simply called Interactionism. This theory corresponds with our ordinary common-sense experience of events in the world. Take this careless child who trips and falls down. The impact of the child's body with the ground causes an excitement of the central nervous system, which reports to the brain. For simplicity's sake, we'll call this brain event 1, or B1. Registering the information from the rest of the body, the brain then causes the feeling of pain, or mental event 1. This mental event, in turn, causes a second mental event. We'll call it mental event 2, which is the reaction to the awareness of the pain, or mental event 1. Now, mental event 2 then causes the brain to react and send a signal to the rest of the body to say, ouch! What we observe in this theory is a two-way interaction between bodies and minds. Brain events can cause mental events, and mental events can cause brain events. Even though the brain is made of matter and the mind is made of thought stuff, on this view, they are supposed to interact. Of course, there's no worry about physical-to-physical causation or even mental-to-mental causation because, of course, they're supposed to be the same kind of stuff. The peculiar part of this theory is the two-way interaction between physical and mental stuff. But here's the thing. To assert that this interaction takes place is one thing. To explain how it actually works is quite different. And this explanatory model doesn't really explain anything. It merely asserts what seems to be taking place between our mind and our brain. And as you can imagine, philosophers have been troubled by the lack of causal explanation in this model. That has led other dualists to propose alternative accounts of how minds and bodies might possibly interact. Now, the second theory of mind-body interaction we'll examine takes the idea of substance dualism very seriously. If there really are two completely different substances from which mental events and physical events are composed, how could they actually interact at all? Parallelism begins by embracing this fundamental difference in stuff and attempts to explain the relationship between these two very different kinds of experiences. Again, we'll start with our child skinning his knee. The impact with the ground causes the brain event in the material world at what we'll call time 1. That brain event gives rise to a second brain event at some second time 2, which is the cause of the body's saying ouch, which of course is a physical event. But at the very same time as brain event 1 is occurring, mental event 1, the experience of the pain, is also occurring. And at time 2, a second mental event occurs, the distress of feeling the pain. On this analysis, physical events cause physical events, and mental events can cause mental events, but physical events do not cause mental events, nor can mental events cause physical ones. What we have here are two distinct chains of causation in the universe. One, physical to physical, the other, mental to mental. But why would mental events like pain be correlated with certain physical events, leading us to mistakenly think that there is interaction between the two substances? The answer is called pre-established harmony. the idea that both physical and mental causal chains have been running parallel to each other, almost like two parallel universes laid over on top of one another. The correlation between the physical chain and the mental chain might lead us to think that the two phenomena are causally related, but in fact they are not, and cannot be causally related since they are two completely different substances. Occasionalism, like parallelism, takes the idea of substance dualism very seriously and rejects the idea that physical events could cause mental events, and vice versa. So, starting with our example, we find a physical event in the world. The brain event at time 1, being a physical event, can cause an appropriate brain effect at time 2. Here we find straightforward material causation. But at time 1, we also have the occurrence of mental event 1. Two different events correlated in time. Similarly, at time 2, we have the correlation of brain event 2 and mental event 2. Now, so far, this just seems to be exactly the same as parallelism. The difference comes when the occasionalist addresses the cause of mental events 1 and 2. Where do they come from? An occasionalist believes that each of these events is a unique occasion, which is either caused directly by or an expression of the mind of God. On this view, God, or the cosmic consciousness, is the source of all non-physical realities. What we take to be an individual mental event is really, according to this view, nothing more than either the divine mind manifesting itself in the material world of time and space, or a uniquely created mental event to coexist with a particular physical event. Therefore, what I take to be my mind is perhaps little more than an expression of the cosmic consciousness, is expressing itself in the material universe of time and space. Now, we've looked so far at 3 different dualist explanations of mind-body interaction, each firmly rooted in substance dualism. Our final view might be put forward by either a substance dualist or a property dualist, as it will be compatible with either ontological starting point. Taking our standard example, we have an event in the material world, which manifests in a particular brain event B1, which is accompanied by the mental event of pain. That brain event, according to the Epiphenomenalist, then causes a material effect in the form of brain event 2. But brain event 2 is also accompanied by an attendant mental event, that is, the awareness of the pain and the desire for it to go away. What's unique to this view is to think of mental events as the byproduct or effect of physical events, but not themselves part of the causal chain of events in the world. Like heat or light that's given off from fire, they are epiphenomena, events that are the byproduct of some set of properly basic events in the material chain of causation. They simply ride above the causal chain. The mental events on this view are seen as emergent properties, given off as effects of physical causation, but they have no causal power of their own. In Epiphenomenalism, what we have is one-way causation. Brain events can cause mental events, but mental events are not causing anything else. They are merely the byproducts of the physical chain of causation in the material world. Now, if you don't find any of these positions particularly convincing, don't worry, because even the philosophers that advocated for them were well aware of the incomplete nature of the hypotheses they were putting forward to explain our common sense impression that mind and body are two different things and yet somehow interact with each other. As we move from Descartes to Malebranche and then on to Leibniz, we see an exhaustive attempt to conceptualize what would be required to account for two distinct substances interacting to form a mind-body nexus. But by the time we get to Lemaitre, we see the beginning of a shift away from the hard distinction of substance dualism toward a more monistic, indeed materialistic view, and it would be just 100 years after Lemaitre that our observational data began to catch up to the exhaustive philosophical work that had come before. The real breakthrough came in the amazing case of Phineas Gage. A railroad foreman, Gage was gravely injured when an accidental explosion drove an iron tamping rod through his skull, causing severe trauma to the frontal lobes of his brain. Of course, having blunt or even sharp objects driven through the brain was nothing new. But what was revolutionary was that Gage survived his injuries. And in the aftermath of the massive trauma he suffered, he was said to have undergone changes in his personality. Now, careful historical analysis has shown that many of the reports of this transformation were significantly exaggerated. The kernel of the truth, that his quote-unquote mind was altered by the physical injuries to his brain, was the beginning of the end of the traditional dualistic accounts of the mind. If an injury to the brain could cause a change in personality, perhaps the most non-physical entity, consciousness, is more physical in nature than previously thought. Epiphenomenalism had already proposed that mental events were a byproduct of brain events, and the case of Phineas Gage seemed to provide actual observational data supporting something like this view. As continuing advancements in medical technology, particularly the development of antibiotics in the mid-20th century, allowed more people suffering severe brain trauma to survive their initial injuries, more and more data began to become available that suggested that changes to the physical structures of the brain would likely result in changes to what had traditionally been considered the soul. Perhaps there wasn't a clear distinction between the mind and the brain, as had once been thought. From there, of course, it was just a small step to suggest that brain chemistry might be just as significant in determining our mental states as the actual physiological structures of the brain itself. The discovery that compounds like thorazine or promethazine not only induced relaxation in patients agitated by mental disorders, it also helped to eliminate some of the symptoms of the disorders themselves. So that by the time we get to the second half of the 20th century, psychopharmacology was a growing field of research, producing clinical results for psychiatric disorders that had eluded scientific medical treatment until then. This, in turn, would lead to a host of new competing materialist theories of the mind. One of the earliest was behaviorism. It's the view that behavior, both observable reflexes and conditioned responses, are primarily to be studied and understood through the vehicle of physiology. This is an extension of the Cartesian idea of animal behavior as a purely biological mechanism with no internal conscious states at all. Since the line between human species and other animal species was becoming less and less pronounced, why shouldn't human behavior be analyzed using the same methodology? But since we can't observe these inner states of consciousness associated with human beings, behaviorists, at least early on, suggested that they were not proper subjects of scientific analysis at all. But B.F. Skinner argued that even those internal states, those we traditionally associate with the conscious mind, could be part of the proper domain of scientific analysis, so radical behaviorism became the dominant theory of mind for philosophical movements like American pragmatism in the early part of the 20th century. Now, although radical behaviorism, also called neo-behaviorism, had led to some practical therapeutic benefits in the application of cognitive modification, it never fully addressed the perplexing set of questions about all of those internal states that we call conscious states. To refer to all the thinky things in my mind as just so many behaviors, reflexive or otherwise, just didn't seem to provide an adequate analysis and explanation of what we know are existent phenomena. Material reductivism, also known as type physicalism, or even more simply as the identity theory, was put forward as a more serious attempt to address the material nature of our mental states. Defended by philosophers like J.J.C. Smart, this theory, or rather set of theories, holds that mental events just are brain events. It holds that there is an identity relationship between the neurological activity of the brain and the things we call ideas, memories, thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and experiences of all kinds. Just because we call them mental events doesn't change what they actually are: specific neurological activity in a particular brain. Whether we observe Venus in the early morning and call it the morning star, or observe it in the evening and call it the evening star, it's just one thing, the planet Venus. Sure, in the past, people may have thought that they were two different celestial bodies and assigned them different names, but those names just refer to one and the same astronomical body. So, too, we may have talked in the past as if mental events and brain events are two different things, but they're really not different at all. Now, the conclusions of the identity theory have led philosophers like Patricia and Paul Churchland, as well as others, to argue that we ought to eliminate, as far as possible, mental language from our vocabulary entirely. Even if we can't demonstrate a one-to-one correlation with specific brain events due to the limitations of our current imaging technology, this is just a temporary problem that will be addressed by further scientific and technological advancement. But even more important in the eliminativist point of view, hanging on to the archaic terminology can do great harm to our ability to conceptualize the mind-brain identity and prevent us from making the kind of progress we might otherwise make. After all, we no longer talk about demon possession as the cause of personality disorder or psychotic episodes in those suffering mental illness. So why should we even talk about mental illness? If we follow the reductivist hypothesis, we're really just talking about brain illness, not mental illness, because there's no such thing as a mind. If there's no such thing as a mind, it certainly can't be ill. Undoubtedly, it would be awkward for a while until we've created a new physiological language and vocabulary for all of those thinky things, but that shouldn't stop us from working to become as precise as we can in our description and analysis of the phenomena of consciousness. But what if it turns out that there isn't actually a one-to-one correspondence between a particular mental event and a specific set of neurons, dendrites, and synapses in a particular brain? This leads us to the functionalist theory, or model, of the philosophy of mind. Initially advocating for this position, philosophers like Hilary Putnam distinguished between what we might call the hardware of consciousness, that is the brain, and the output of consciousness, that is functional states. To oversimplify the argument for the purposes of introduction, we can think of the very same processing unit in a computer as being capable of producing a near infinite set of outputs based on how the software dictates that the microcircuits open and close. We don't need a specific set of circuits to get a specific output. The very same set of circuits can give rise to many different functions of the very same computer. Perhaps our neural networks operate in a similar fashion. The very same set of neurons might be capable of producing a wide variety of mental events without the need of mapping a particular mental event onto a specific set of biomachinery in the brain, as the identity theory holds. Now, regardless of whether one comes down on the side of mind-brain identity or something more like behaviorism/functionalism, all of these theories tend to be physicalist in their approach. They all reject the idea of mental events as ontologically distinct from material events. The question of which approach is best is still an open question and still being researched within the field of the philosophy of mind. Let's recap what we've covered in this all too brief introduction to the philosophy of mind. Dualism is the view that minds and their content are an ontologically distinct set of entities from the material world. But if they really are distinct, we need to account for how these two different realities seem to interact or correspond to each other. We introduced 4 dualist approaches to mind-body interaction, from Cartesian interactionism all the way to Epiphenomenalism, which, as we noted, could be compatible with a materialist ontology. We then came forward to the 20th century and introduced 4 materialist or physicalist theories of mind. While most philosophers working in the philosophy of mind today would fall into the materialist camp, there are many questions and puzzles that have not yet been adequately resolved, and active investigation continues. There's also a movement to combine the fields of philosophy of mind and neurophysiology and psychology, and some schools even offer dual degrees in this ongoing area of research. Hopefully, this brief video has provided you with an overview of some of the main positions in this fascinating subfield of metaphysics. Be sure to come back again next time as we continue to learn a little bit of philosophy.